Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Munro Live. I know you're probably disappointed that
the B team.
The B team today. Sandy and Corey couldn't be here. They're actually down in Texas for the Gigafactory. So they're doing some activities down there. So they'll be joining us on some of the next videos coming up. Today we're going to be talking about the Tesla Model S Plaid body in white structure. With me is Kevin Hardy. So Kevin Hardy, for those of you who don't know, actually helps lead some of our body structure new product development activities in-house here. So, and prior to that, he did a lot of the automotive benchmarking for about 8 years or so at one of our benchmarking facilities for an OEM. So he'll bring a lot of knowledge to the table, and I think with that, we can probably get started. So Kevin is, if you want to start with some observations, and we can move through.
Sure. So to kind of start off, if I reference kind of like an older Tesla, the older Model S, that's typically referring to the 2011/2012 to 2015 model years. Tesla's made a series of revisions throughout that time period, but the first Model S that Joe and I had ever seen was I believe a 2013, and there's some notable differences between that Tesla Model S and this one. Like starting in the front would be the rail sections themselves. So overall, the strategy is the same with using extruded aluminum sections, but the previous version used like octagonal sections for the rails. It's pretty neat in the sense of you have a lot of like local rigidity within the panels themselves, but it makes mounting anything to it extremely difficult. As you can see with these nice rectangular sections, nice flat spaces that you can mount anything you'd like to it. Kind of going forward.
And just in case they couldn't scan it, they put a tiny little QR code sticker on the side of the rail. So
that's for the NSA, so they can see it from space.
Yeah.
So, and then kind of as we move rearward here, one of the big departures for this generation, at least for the Model X, is the old one used to have a load beam that kind of came down here from the hinge pillar and extended forward and would reach out to the forward part of the front end structural module of the vehicle. That's pretty common in a lot of vehicles. In general, actually, like the departure and kind of moving away from that is a little unique, but it does kind of, I think, lend itself to a little bit of where some of the emphasis that Tesla is putting some of their body structure monuments. So there was a casting in the previous Model S. There's a much more larger and encompassed casting here. You can see it's essentially gloving over the rail itself. It is fastened together and it has panel adhesive, running through all the major joints. If I recall correctly, and it's been some time, the older Model S was a casting, but it's sleeved kind of over the rails as such, and the cross-car beam going across, the shock tower brace was welded in, to those castings. Obviously, with the super beam and the integration that we saw there, that's one part where some of that integration came out of the body, went into another system, and enabled I would say a significant amount of cross-car functionality. Just it's simply not seen in a lot of other BEVs.
For sure, it's interesting when you mention the structural adhesive. A lot of people look at this and they're like, oh, there's a lot of bolts. That's what's holding it together. The structural adhesive may help, but in fact, when that structural adhesive sets up, in many cases, it's doing more structural adhesion work than the fasteners, the mechanical fasteners themselves. So that stuff is quite powerful in terms of maintaining connection between parts.
Yeah, it's a significant enabler to get much more rigid body structures than in the past with just essentially either spot welding or SPRs, other fastening methods, just in general. So,
which you'll see examples of that
throughout
the entire vehicle.
Kind of rearward in the vehicle.
Yeah.
The early Model S's with the octagonal rails, if I recall correctly, did not have a CV pass-through, for the front. So this enables, there's some more pickup points for the cradle itself. And I know in your review of Sandy and my review of Sandy with the suspension, somebody made a comment about, why there were some slip planes within the fastening points with the cradles being essentially cast, specifically in the rear. Well, obviously, you can look here and look at all these joints. There's a significant amount of slip that is required, in the body in white to get it to assemble correctly, and how they nest. Typically, we would do a net left build off this corner here, but that's one of the reasons why you'll see especially in some chassis to body interfaces, potentially some additional slip planes there. It's just something I wanted to point out since someone had called it out in one of the video comments.
For those of you who don't know, when we say slip, we're talking about manufacturing adjustability, right? If everything on the body structure was always the exact same fit, then in theory you wouldn't need any slip, right? If you've got perfect quality control over your cradle or your subframe and your body structure, all the points should always align. But we live in a first principles based world, and that is not how these things always come together. There's always some variation in tolerance, right, from a GD&T perspective. So for those of you who don't know, that's geometric dimensioning and tolerancing, and how these things come together. So you need some adjustability, otherwise you will very likely run into a no-build condition where fastening points simply don't line up. And that's a major issue. That's not something you want to run into in job one or any time after, right?
You'll either end up scrapping a body structure or a significant amount of rework later down the line. With respect, again, to the shock towers, one of the big differences between this iteration and previous, way more integration. So you can see all the additional mounting points that they have integrated into this. There's a lot more subtle features with respect to this, and they've really kind of taken to heart one of the advantages of castings is providing pickup points and interfacing points, indexing points, anything like that within it. It's essentially free with respect if you're staying within the tool draw considerations for the castings themselves.
And I did mention it in a previous video, but just to reiterate, if this is the first video on the structure you're seeing, one of the reason that you would go under the half shaft or let the half shaft pass through is what you get is an additional section underneath the rail, right? So underneath where that half shaft goes right here, we would call this a structural section, right? So you can actually transfer energy through that. And the taller this section is, right, from the bottom side of the rail to the top of the shock tower or the overall rail section, right, this whole area, the stiffer this front end is going to be. If you look at it like a moment arm, which it is, this whole thing is taking up all of the front end suspension loads. It's carrying the drive module. There's a lot of mass that's out on this moment arm. So the stiffer they can make this, the better they can manage NVH, the better they can tune the suspension, the better it's going to be just in terms of durability, so on and so forth. So like Range Rover, who also did something very similar to this, there is advantages of doing this, but they are sacrificing some build process elements, like they can no longer deck the half shafts with the EDM, right? Because if it's being brought up from the underside of the vehicle, the half shaft would run right into this section that I was just pointing out. So now they need to feed the half shaft through to the EDM. So adjustments on the sequencing side, but they are getting some performance and dynamics benefit.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And to include with your conversation about the moment arm, one thing that really interests me with this section, and Zach, if you want to come around, is I don't want to say the lack of integration. It seems very deliberate. So I'd love to have a conversation about essentially the lack of panels that kind of blend into the dash panel or move cross car. There's a nice extrusion that runs across here. It's pretty sizable for the toe board, but there is a pretty sizable cavity on a lot of on ICE vehicles specifically. This would be an area of the vehicle you kind of call the horse collar, and you would see a lot of integration to get energy to move cross car or around the engine in that case, and then start going into the underbody rails of the vehicle itself. So it's kind of an interesting characteristic that there's not a lot of continuity in this particular spot. One thing I do really like though is from a body structure, but the very smooth transition as it comes off the shock tower into the hinge pillar and then up into the A pillar. I like it a lot. It's I know Jordan, you've mentioned it a couple times, like water. The smoother you can get these transitions for loads, the better it is. Reduce considerations for hot spots and stuff like that in various impact scripts or other sort of performance targets you're trying to achieve with the vehicle. So there's it's a pretty sizable section itself. And then as you can see how much more encompassing the casting is as it reaches back here towards the hinge pillar itself and the very large extruded rocker, which I think is the first, for me at least, extruded rocker I'd seen on the original Model S that we looked at, the 2013.
Yeah, it's you know, when you were mentioning the void in the tail end of these longitudinal rails, right? These front end structures, I would imagine, you know, again, I would love to pick Tesla's brain in terms of how they are managing all that energy. But with these giant castings, they're getting an immense amount of torsional rigidity out of these, I would imagine. So, you know, I suppose in that case, if they're getting enough and you don't need it,
it's
now
just additional parts.
Yeah, they're just opening up more space, right? You can see if a horse collar did go through here, this is the pass-through for their I shaft or intermediate shaft on their steering column, right? If they did have a section here, you can see how, and then the booster, the brake booster sitting up here, it ends up getting very, very tight in this area. So if you can eliminate that and you don't need it, more power to you. But most people do have it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And one thing that's kind of the fact that this was a lot of luxury vehicles or like E-segment vehicles in general often don't get crash tested. You know, I don't know if they feel because their volume is so low, it's not worth it. The tests are expensive to run. So the fact that they did run this through like small overlap in 2016 and 2017 is kind of surprising, because a lot of other luxury sedans or saloons or whatever you want to kind of call them for that whole vehicle segment don't get run through those tests. It did all right. It did acceptable in small overlap. There is, as far as like kind of how they graded those various categories. So overall, it scored acceptable. Good is obviously the best category that you can do. It was acceptable for head injury and leg injury, and good in the other categories for torso injuries and things of that nature. But in some ways, I think it suffers much like a lot of rear-wheel drive ICE vehicles do. It's a very hard, much like subcompact cars, it's a very hard test. And subcompact cars is kind of where this test came through, because essentially it was shearing off the sides of vehicles because you're bypassing the primary load structure. So we have this massive section here. And then if you were in a full frontal impact, now we have two. 40% offset, there's just one. But again, there's still a sizable amount of material here to engage the rest of the body structure. For small overlap, you know, it comes in at 25%, and it's typically coming in this area. The bumper does extend outward. It does have a splayed crush can, which was not present on the earlier versions of the Model S, which helps with this. But essentially, you know, the barrier would come in here, hit this casting, and then loads up the hinge pillar. So when we showed like the cradle itself here is pretty small. It doesn't have anything like the Mach-E. The Mach-E has a cast large section here, and then it has some steel tusks that come out and have some stanchions that pick up the forward part of the rails here, which catch the barrier, and it's blending a kind of offensive strategy to try and get you off the barrier and engage primary load structure early, where this is kind of like the Hyundai and Kia has a more defensive approach with its body structure, and you can see the size of the rocker. It's absolutely substantial.
And maybe at this time, it's probably worth mentioning or highlighting what we mean by offensive and defensive. Specifically with regard to SORB, small overlap rigid barrier, it's engaging 25% based on the total vehicle width of the car, right? So in space, you'll draw a line, 25%, that's where the structure would engage with the car and a frontal or forward-facing impact. When we say offensive, what we're saying is that you're trying to get the vehicle as soon as possible and as smoothly as possible to glance off and away from the barrier, right? So if you're only engaging on the left side, the goal is to engage enough structure early enough in the impact and have a smooth enough transition as you go rearward so that the vehicle glances off the barrier. We think that's good for a couple of reasons. One, secondary impacts, and two, you could say vehicle pulse index, or the amount of immediate acceleration or G loads that the occupant will see is typically reduced because you're glancing off and you don't have a hard impact. So that's offensive. Defensive is, whereas Kevin was mentioning, where you don't have as much structure early on to get that glancing effect to divert away from the barrier. You reserve more structure further rearward in car, in the hinge pillar and in this upper load beam. You essentially reinforce this as much as you need to so that it's quite literally defensive. So you're okay with the barrier essentially getting all the way to the hinge pillar, but when it gets to this point, you want this whole area to be as robust as possible But typically what we see in those, it's a telltale. If the vehicle's going through the impact scenario, it will come all the way to the hinge pillar, and it'll stop quite abruptly and pivot out to the side. And so when we're talking about secondary impacts, if now you're broadside to traffic that's coming behind you, now you're exposed to a side impact or T-bone, right?
Yeah.
Versus the glance, which keeps you more in line with traffic.
Yeah, so the XC90, most Volvos in general, because it's kind of where this test kind of came from, perform exceedingly well, in these impact environments. So they kind of skip off, they'll shear off the wheel, and they move right past the barrier. I almost would volunteer to crash in one of those, because it does do, it does do so well. As I mentioned, the Model S does acceptable. The 2016, the wheel did not fragment. It came in, it hit the hinge pillar relatively hard, and there was some passenger intrusion. And that's ultimately what you're really trying to manage is passenger intrusion with this particular test. There were some revisions. They ran it again, which is admirable. In 2017, the wheel did fragment, but they had some brake caliper components come into, and they split the hinge pillar. So a lot of vehicles, like I said, do struggle with this. It's kind of, hats off to whether or not Tesla provided the vehicles to IIHS or they bought them themselves, but given the popularity and just probably interest in how EVs would perform in this. But it's kind of one aspect that's kind of interesting with this is the lack of kind of some of the structure here. And with respect to offensive, defensive, they both have their merits from like an architectural perspective. I actually kind of like the defensive strategy because you as a customer get the weight and mass all the time. And what I mean by that is whatever we're doing to integrate and get this load around you as the occupant, if you get hit from the side, those features work for you. If you're driving aggressively, those features can help you. That weight and cost that's being added to the vehicle, you get to essentially enjoy in areas of your vehicle that are not a 25% small overlap. Where if you do have a lot of this mass that's kind of coming forward, there's not a lot of suspension inputs that really drive. There is some benefit by tying essentially the whole motor bay area or engine bay area rail or load pass together, but not as much. Like the big tusks and things of that nature, essentially they can help with some pedestrian considerations. Sure. For those impact scenarios as well, but really it's kind of for, it's a targeted approach to mitigate a certain impact script, and they're just kind of along for the ride unless you have an impact such as that. So,
sure. So maybe before we move rearward in vehicle, just kind of a funny little thing that we like to point out. Right, so as this body side outer, right, part of the A pillar, and by body side outer, it's like the A surface that everyone's going to see. Typically one of the largest stampings on a body in white, a body structure. If you look in the end here, it's just an open void, but inside there, you're going to see some foam stuffed in there. So they put this foam in here because even with the cowl on the vehicle and with the fender in place, you will get some air that passes into this void. And we've seen instances where, quite literally, this acts like an organ tube when you're driving down the vehicle, and you get some pretty nasty noises coming from it. So that's the reason for the foam. But generally, this area and tying this to the structure below it is very difficult because you're trying to manage depth of draw, right? So that when you're stamping the body side outer, if you go too deep, right, too far inboard relative to sort of the nominal surface, and it's too abrupt, too sharp of a change, you will actually start tearing this material during the stamping process. And when we get to the rear, we'll show you another example of how they sort of mitigated that on the C pillar as it comes down. So maybe we'll move cabin side here and highlight a couple more things. So what do you see here in the cabin side, Kevin?
So again, as I kind of mentioned, we have the extruded toe board going across. Again, I'm a big fan of extrusions. They're cheap to tool up, and especially in this case, you have these castings that are captivating the extrusions themselves, so you don't have to get into, I would say, a more complex assembly consideration or fixturing consideration with a heavily, extruded base structure, if you will. Like for instance, like the Rivian cradle, a lot of extrusions, a lot of fixtures there. So, but this is all kind of naturally captivating it. This is substantially, if I recall correctly, smaller. I think the castings came back a little bit farther on the rocker, so there was a lot of optimization going on here with the ribs and things of that nature for this area of the vehicle.
And I think they were also sand casts, right, if you remember, on the original iteration. And so the curves, right, on the inboard side of that transition, they were quite a bit smoother. Whereas you see on these castings, you're able to take that casting formation and go right to a tight corner and then supplement with some ribbings on the inboard side. You know, it's funny, you probably are wondering, if you've never seen this before, what are these pads? These are what we would typically refer to as like mastic pads or NVH pads. And so essentially in certain conditions, whether it's stone impingement, likely not in this case because we've got a battery pack underneath, or just what we would call pumping or oil canning on the floor panel. Putting these pads can allow, in some cases, the panel itself that it's adhered to be a little bit thinner, right? So you can get away with some thinner panels by supplementing with this. But generally, if you see these, it's not a good thing, right? They're typically placed as a Band-Aid of sorts. Ideally, no body in white would have any mastic pads, any beta patches, any LASD, which is a different variation of that right here. So LASD stands for liquid applied sound deadener. So all of these things are in effort to make the vehicle quieter, give the customer a better sense when driving it. But just kind of another quick note. This is not super common, but if you look at the underside of this, it's all dimpled, right? So typically a lot of these mastic pads have like a tar backing. We've got some in the back we can show you. This one's actually got a bunch of dimples in it. So similar to what we've seen on dash panels, you get sort of the golf ball effect. By having all of these dimples in here, they're probably getting some NVH benefit, canceling out some additional frequencies. So just kind of an interesting note there.
No, yeah. And one thing to kind of, highlight in general, we were kind of taking a quick, getting refamiliar, if you will, for the car yesterday, and some of the other guys looking at it would hate to be the body in white fastener manager for this vehicle. There's not a ton of different types, but there is a lot. You have, self-piercing rivets, you have blind rivets, there's, rib nuts all throughout the vehicle. We have bolts going throughout it. They come from a legacy, automotive body background, and it's just something that there's a lot of enablers to this, because you can, with one-sided access, you might not be able to weld this, but you can come in and fasten these things. So that's an enabler for certain design considerations, but you do have to pay for fasteners. There's the weight associated with fasteners, and you got to manage them getting into the plant. But one of the big things that you said, in general, there is a lot of different styles going on, especially different areas, which they found was interesting. Granted, depending on how your stations are set up, it may not be a huge hurdle, because as the vehicle is progressing through the assembly line, you don't necessarily have to stick with one particular fastening process because it's a different cell. That said, one of the things they like to bring up is, from a quality perspective, if you have some, if someone is out sick or anything like that, and you need to cross-level labor throughout the body shop, you now have to have someone who's familiar with, a much wider range of fastening operations or adjustments, with that body shop. If you were just doing essentially a relatively conventional spot weld assembly, which is being spot welded throughout, which is very similar to what the Mach-E has done. It's an all-steel body structure. Yeah. But that's just one thing. That, and then the adhesive and some of the sealer is a little sloppy within the vehicle itself. There's a lot of excess, seepage through some of it. Typically you see a little bit as it kind of comes through, and this would be, I would consider, like normal in this area. Throughout here is a little excessive, but kind of through this area here with where the castings are being joined, and the cowl and like plenum and dash panel area, it seems a little excessive. So it's it's material you're paying for, and it's weight that you're carrying that you don't necessarily need. And it's not uncommon, to be honest, for even the body teams not to know what a body in white weighs once it comes out of production, because of a lot of variables like this, both material and kind of consumables for adhesives and things of that nature.
Yeah, typically when we're scoring a manufacturing process, as we're mapping it out and we're assigning times and quality burdens and things of that nature, anything that's a consumable, an adhesive, a liquid applied sound deadener, a sealant, all of those typically get scored a little bit harsher. One, because it's messy and it's unpredictable in terms of how much you're actually going to use per instance. And the other thing is if it gets applied incorrectly, you need to manually fix it, right? So we'll show you some instances as we go through, and actually maybe Zach, if you swing around here, on the dash panel, we've got all of this white sealant, right? So all of this stuff right here. But in tight areas or areas that may be difficult to get appropriate coverage, you see this. So that is maybe a manual or robotically applied sealant, relatively consistent bead across. And then in areas where they didn't get the coverage that they wanted, they quite literally came in here with a brush or a spatula type tool to spread it out and get the proper coverage. So ideally, you'd never have to touch it again, but almost every body in white that we see that has sealant or adhesive, there's always secondary touches or processes that are induced. So, but in some cases, it's a necessary evil. So maybe if we look at the door ring. So let's.
Did you want to speak to the A-pillar first? I know we talked a lot about it yesterday.
Sure.
You know, and then it kind of gets into the door ring. I mean, you had some comments about length of line and.
Yeah, so with regard to the A-pillar, just kind of an interesting note in comparison to some of its sister vehicles, Model 3 and the Model Y specifically. If you're sitting in a Model 3 or Model Y and you look out to the right, the section height, right, the A-pillar, how big it looks, meaning how much of the outside world it's obscuring, is pretty substantial. And we were thinking about, like, why is that? Well, if you look at those cars, the distance from the header down to where the A-pillar touches the cowl area, interfacing with the shotgun and the hinge pillar, one, it's pretty long, just the pure centerline length, A to B. The other thing is it's laid down. So talking about the rake angle, it's laid down quite a bit. When you make it longer and the rake angle is laid down, so like this, it would go like this, right? You know, so it's the pillar is not stood up, it's laid down. When you do that, because of the roof crush requirements, right? It's based off the weight of the vehicle. You crush the roof, it can only deflect, I believe it's 120 millimeters before you start to fail the test. Because of those properties or characteristics of the Model 3 and the Model Y, that section likely needs to grow quite a bit so that they get enough structure and it doesn't deflect and therefore give them a fail condition. But on the Model S, a couple of things to notice. One, it seems to be quite a bit more stood up, right? So that's going to help just dynamically through the crush event. The pillar is smaller, and then the distance from the header to the next closest, I'll say, true section is much shorter, right? So the hinge pillar, and you could probably see it better on that side, maybe Kevin, if you wanted to point to it. Yeah, this area where the hinge pillar comes up is probably helping them reduce the actual section size on the A-pillar because they're bringing this hinge pillar structure so far up in vehicle. So just kind of interesting as we look at it. And if you have a Model 3 or Model Y or you've driven one and you're like, why is that pillar so big?
Now you know.
That's probably why.
Maybe.
Yep. All right, everyone. So we're actually going to break this up into two parts. The video went a little bit longer than expected, but there's some good content. So stay tuned for part two, where Kevin and I continue with the rest of the body structure. Real quick before we close it out, just wanted to give a shout out to Sabic. Thank you for supporting both the teardowns as well as the road trips. Much appreciated. And then Corey's going to be happy. Please go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Thank you.